What's up, squad? This is Brandon from the Bantu Sun. Thank you so much for joining me today. So, the date is set for March 7th in Miami, Florida. President Donald Trump and his administration is to host some Latin American conservative leaders in Miami, and the summit is supposed to be around regional integration, shoring up security, American leadership, and being a deterrent, and building a strategy on how to deal with China in a region. This is definitely America to certain its leadership within the hemisphere. I think it's very interesting. I just heard Marco Rubio, Secretary Rubio, Secretary of State, say in an interview or in a conversation, the world, oh, the old world is gone. The world as we knew it is over with. Now there's a new world with us, and with that new world comes a new world order. It's so interesting to see how things evolved. Whether you were uh, dealing with pre-World War I or in the age of colonialism, and how the world had to deal with that, with Europeans going to different areas, colonizing, setting up administrations, some types of wars of liberation, and people trying to figure out who they were in this new integration of the globe, which had never been done before 1500. And then you move on to you have your wars, World War I, World War II, these more or less European civil wars, but world wars, especially when you integrate the Asia component into it as well, and how nations rose and fall, whether you're dealing with Japan and China and Germany and Russia, and how that all shipped out, and that resulted in the Cold War, where you kind of had the Americas or the West on one side, the Soviet bloc on another side, and then the third or developing world or the global South on the sidelines. And there was kind of this battle between the West and the Soviet blocs for ideology. And then we have this post Cold War world. And why that's important is I think that with the Cold War, the West really didn't know how to deal with Russia, I believe. And I think what happened is when Russia came on, it was a level of competition and integration that the Western leaders really didn't have to deal with for decades since the end of World War II. And even before that, because if you think about it before that, Russia really wasn't global. But in World War II, after World War II, they were global, but within a certain restricted frame. And America had its allies. But when the Soviet Union fell, now Russia was kind of unleashed. Now it was another country. And Russia is just not another country. It's the world's largest country with abundant resources, pretty much self sufficient in almost any metric you can think of, almost. And this became a competitive partner. And they still had global power aspirations. They still walk with a swag as if they saw themselves as a global leader. And I believe a lot in the West, this concerned them, and I think this is why they had no problems dropping such harsh restrictions on them once Russia gave them the green light by invading Ukraine. So you have this situation where the world is realigning. So you have that Russian component, and now you're introduced the rise of China, a billion people plus in China, a billion people plus in India, and what America is saying is the way we were doing things, we can no longer do. And one of the ways that they're changing is integration with Latin America. America's always been strong in Latin America, but previously they were kind of disinterested. They ran up the score. They became a strong hemispheric power beyond anyone's reaching the hemisphere, and they pretty much put cordon off to Latin America. They said, "Look, we're not going to bother too much, but you're under our control." I think Trump is well. It's always been like the doctrine, or whether you're talking about the Roosevelt corollary or you're talking about the Monroe Doctrine or the Dunroe Doctrine. There's always been this understanding for American security. They want to keep everybody else out or peer powers out and consolidate power. And you have some rogue states such as Cuba and Venezuela, which the West has tolerated. But now Trump is his leadership style, and I think this is the end of the Cold War. Like old Venezuela, old Cuba, it seemed like those were more of the Cold War world. That the world that Trump wants now he's actively bringing on board a lot of these leaders in Latin America. One thing I find interesting as well is this is a guy who's not ideological at all. A lot of people say that about him. He's willing to work with people that's going to work with him. These are all conservative leaders. The countries that are expected to be involved: Argentina, Paraguay, Ecuador, Bolivia, El Salvador, Honduras. These are all countries which he believes he can build a relationship with. I always look at who's in and who's out. These are interesting countries who he have. You know, you have President Javier Milei in Argentina, and everybody knows about how they had to deal with rapid inflation. But he's been a great ally for the Trump administration, as well as Bukele and El Salvador, and the things that he's done, and basically rolling out the red carpet for finances, especially in the fintech industry. You have Honduras, which is a great geopolitical play because it's central in Central America, in between, nestled between Guatemala, Nicaragua, and El Salvador. You also have Ecuador, a major port on the west coast of South America, and Bolivia, a massive resource state. And then, of course, you have Paraguay, which is slightly becoming one of the great Western anchors in Latin America. So it's a lot of overlap ideologically. I don't want to say ideologically, functionally for President Trump. And I think it's really interesting. And I think this is why Secretary Rubio is so apt at this point in time because he speaks their language. I remember there's the same famous saying by President Nelson Mandela, the former leader of South Africa, where he said, you know, you speak to a person in your language like you're speaking to their mind. If you speak in their language, you're speaking to their heart. Something of this nature. Well, more or less, this is the thing. When Secretary of State Rubio stands in front of those Latin leaders and he speaks to them in their own language, it really promotes a sense of camaraderie. So it doesn't look so much like the big bad gringo or the Western imperialists or the European or the Anglo imperialists coming down to talk down to these Latin American leaders. It's actually them talking to a child of Latin America. Marco Rubio has ancestry from Cuba. So, and that also leads the case of what's to happen to these other countries. As you see, Cuba's going through a lot right now as far as resource scarcity, primarily around oil. And the leader of Venezuela was just swapped out. Now, I also look at what countries are not included on the list. A lot of the left leaning countries or left in ideology are not necessarily included. Whether you're talking about President Lula da Silva and in Brazil, he was left off. Brazil, one of the largest countries in the world, third largest in the hemisphere. There are massive countries. Brazil is it pretty much swamps South America. So it's interesting strategically leaving him off the play, but he's also leaving the president of Mexico as well. So these are two. I always say Latin America is really two anchors. The Hispanic portion or Mexico because they have the largest population of Spanish speakers in the world, and then you also have Brazil, the Lusophone country of Brazil. These two pivotal countries are not expected to be at this summit. So, which is I think also interesting because you would imagine, as I said, to me strategically that would make sense. But Trump is working or looking to work with people that he feel he can get things done with. And that speaks to his business side, the transactional nature of how he processes things and get things done. So this is going to be a real interesting meeting. I'm really want to know what's going to come about this and what kind of integration are they looking to establish at this meeting. I do think it's a good sign for American leadership, but I wonder how they're going to counteract China as China has grown. And you got to imagine, like South America, especially a country like Brazil, Argentina, that southern comb has a lot to offer China as far as agricultural goods are concerned. It's a lot of people and they need to eat. So China naturally has, just like Europe, but China even more so has this natural complementary relationship to the North and South America. But when America acting crazy, Argentina and Brazil are there to bail China out. And that's why Trump had a problem really coming down hard on the screws when he was going tariffs and sanctions, is because America really enjoys the cheap stuff that China gets it in such an industrial manner in mass. Whereas American don't have much to barter that way because they can get the same goods, but now you're parceling it out. It'll take 5, 6, 7 countries to equal one China, and you're going to create all types of inefficiencies. There's so many businesses already invested in China. China, they can get food for almost, I don't want to say anywhere, but they have a couple great blocks in this world, whether that's Eastern Europe or South America. So America in that relationship, they didn't have as much as bargaining power. It was a gambit, and America didn't have much of bargaining power. They want to bring China really to their knees, at least not as in good old days. But now China has come along. They don't need America as much as their consumers have grown, as well as their tech base has grown. So this is going to be a real interesting conversation. Looking forward to see what come out of it. Love to hear your insights. Comment below. Make sure you like, share, subscribe if you enjoy the content. Until next time, take care. Back to up.